Welcome to Morae's podcast series, Speaking of Changing Legal, where we discuss the leading trends and innovations reshaping the way legal work is done. In this episode, Morae's Kenzo Tsushima engages in a compelling discussion with special guest Samantha-Anne Nadolny about the most significant trends and challenges that will be shaping legal technology in 2025. She draws from her extensive experience as a corporate attorney, general counsel, and corporate secretary, as well as her role as chair of the Houston Young Lawyers Foundation. Don't miss this insightful conversation and be sure to subscribe for more exciting episodes.
We're going to talk about kind of the 2025 forecast for what we think the legal industry, specifically with reference to legal technology and legal process optimization, is going. So I really want to get your opinion because you've been doing this for basically your whole career and as one of the a young forefront member of doing this. So why don't you talk a little bit about your experience historically and then how you think the legal tech industry is going to evolve as we approach, kind of the crux of 2025 when budgets are resetting, et cetera?
For sure. So legal tech is key to the new legal departments. It's something that I don't think, especially when I started, was really at the forefront. It was something that, we tracked how we could. We used a lot of Excel spreadsheets.
Right.
We went on those godforsaken, yellow legal pads.
Right.
But it's something now where we have opportunities to use technology to make our job easier.
Right.
And there's different types of doing it. The obvious one is everyone has gone to a conference and been hit up by a CLM vendor.
Right.
That is the main piece of tech. But I would also argue it's one of the most important pieces of tech as companies get bigger and contracts become more important.
So let me ask you something. If that's your perspective, and I share that perspective as well, why do you think there's still so much resistance in our industry to full adoption where, hey, why isn't every attorney in a corporate legal department or a law firm really excited to use a new piece of technology, a state-of-the-art CLM? What is preventing that?
People hate change because change is different. You have to learn something new, you have to implement something new, and you have to change the way you're doing it. And that can be on the single side if you're working in a smaller legal department whereby you just don't want to change your process because you're comfortable with it,
right?
Or in a very large legal department of how do we get everyone to adopt it from the top to the bottom, because it's the entire department that has to sign on. It's also, there's a huge transition period when you implement a piece of software where you get it, you demo it, you choose it, and then you have to start to implement, and then you have to change over, and then you have to teach everyone, and then you have to teach the field, and then you have to teach billing. So it's very much that people like to stay in their lane. People don't choose to be uncomfortable by choice, and sometimes implementing legal tech makes them uncomfortable.
And I think our industry, as well as probably the medical field, are the two industries that have historically lagged behind in terms of, testing out or experimenting with new technology, right? So getting people to kind of catalyze their behavior, to make sure that they're testing and experimenting. What have you found? Let's take 2025 aside for a second, but in 2024 or even the last 5 years, what have you felt are the best catalysts to kind of drive the right behavior in terms of that kind of experimentation?
So I think a lot of the times the catalyst for experimentation can be a mistake or an error.
Okay.
Or missing something. So
Okay.
A lot of the times when you're looking at how to chronicle, you're missing a contract. You can't find something. It's been misplaced. You can't read a copy that was signed in 1984 because it's been photocopied and scanned 12 times. You're looking and you're going, there has to be a better way to do this.
Right.
Every single time you need to check a term, you're pulling up your master service agreement.
Right.
Someone has to read all 40 pages. It's something like that that forces you to go, there has to be a better way.
Right.
What can we do? A lot of times I think too that attorneys now are really seeing the importance of networking and going to events. And so people like Morae, they put on really great conferences where you can attend and you can meet some of these CLM vendors. They're just having more functional exposure to it. Once you get functional exposure and you see it, it's like, wow, this could work for me. We could do this.
Right.
This is what I want to do. Like, what if my life was as easy as this guy that just pulled it up on the computer?
Right.
So I think now that we are seeing a lot more of that and people are finding that it doesn't have to be this hard all the time.
Right.
That's a huge catalyst for them taking it back to their company.
Right. It's really interesting. You mentioned kind of the conferences and people getting to see and test out new technology. I think we've all been seeing demos of different, legal tech or generalized technology for the longest time. One of the biggest changes I've seen is that instead of just showing the perfect demo because everything is going to look good in the demo environment, we're getting more hands-on workshops. So people are going to these conferences, and it's one thing to see them be like, oh yeah, I guess I can find a use case for this, rather than having them sit down and try it for 20 minutes and be like, holy crap, this is the power of generative AI. It can give me these insights in 5 minutes with no kind of back-end engineering. It's remarkable, and it's getting GCs, AGCs to be like, hey, wait a minute, I've been resistant to this, but I've tried it for 20 minutes and wanted to try it finally, right?
I think what was key for me is you meet them, you see them, you trial these little in a vacuum. You are You're talking to them, you're looking at their data, you're looking through. What was really key for me, and when I was demoing CLMs most of last year and in late 2023, was when they would do a use case on our data, they would say, send me 50 contracts, send me 50 NDA. Let's go ahead and let's set you up a sandbox. And then you're looking at it and you're like, wow, I could do this. This would make my life so much easier. Every time the business calls and goes, do we have an NDA with so-and-so? You're not going in your file and like, do we scroll? We're just pulling it up and it's chronicled for you. And so I think that the companies that are really getting good and the companies that are really getting people are the ones who are customizing those demos to their data.
Right. Yeah, I mean, obviously that's the best way to do it, right? Because you can instantly see how this will affect your environment.
But it takes work, and not everyone wants to put in the work of doing a sandbox with someone. I bought out 14 systems in a year.
Wow.
And that's something where 13 of them I didn't pick. And that's a lot of time on theirs. But on the other hand, there's a couple that I've recommended to other people who just had more money to spend than I did. And there's some that I have said, this may not be a great option. So I think that you can become an advocate for a system you don't buy.
Right.
There were systems that I absolutely love, but we were lower on the budget end. So I find the works.
I have to dig into this example because 14 is a big number, and obviously 13 to not go with it is a tremendous number. So what put it over the edge? What were your requirements? What did you need to see? What drove that 14th contender to the finish line?
So running in a small legal department, a lot of times you're not looking for a single fix on something. So a contract management cycle software was great, but we needed more than that.
Sure.
So the last 2 times that I've implemented a CLM, we're looking for something that tracks almost all of our legal housing.
Sure.
Where can we put more than just contracts?
Right.
Is there a way we can implement other things we need to organize?
Right.
We've used, and if you've ever worked in a law firm, you've gone and used a summation or a sanction, a litigation tracking database.
Right.
Are we able to have something like that as a module in there? Are we able to track things like real estate? Are we able to track intellectual property? Are we able to put some of the other things that we need to maintain and organize in that same system so we have a one-size-fits-all?
Sure.
Some of those CLMs don't have that. They're such whiz, all of the lights and blinking and everything you can do.
Right.
It'll draft your own contract and do a dance for you.
Right.
But it may not have some of those additional capabilities. Right. So for me, when you're looking on budget and additional capabilities, if you're going to spend more, it needs to do more.
It's such an interesting fine line because I think that's you want it to fit all your requirements, right? And the fine line is there are some highly customizable CLM solutions, and there are some pretty light CLM solutions, but they're so user friendly, and that drives adoption, right? Because for the highly customizable CLM, if you want to build all the workflows, you want to train everyone, it takes a million years, right? But if you have a light instance, you can train folks in 2 hours and you can stand up new workflows in 15 minutes, right? So where do you think the optimal balance is for like a small, mid, and large size organization? Do you think even in a large size organization, you still want to go lean, or do you think you want to lean more towards customizable for the smaller companies?
So I think it can depend. On the smaller companies, if it's customizable, what's key is that smaller companies don't have as many attorneys to set that up. And as much as we wish it would, life and contracts and work doesn't stop when you're in the middle of a CLM implementation.
Right.
A lot of the times you tend to pick the worst time to do it. It'll be in the middle of your largest project. And so you have to do your job as a legal department and implement and train a CLM. So you might want to look as, if I'm buying one that is super, super customizable, it takes a lot more of my time and work.
Right.
Or if I'm buying one that's set and ready to go and it's just data implementation, that's something where we can be up and running. So you have to look at the needs of your specific legal department and your resources. Personally, I've done it multiple ways where we internally worked with the data, or we've contracted for some temporary labor from a place like Morae.
Right.
So we can use a resource where we have a project manager who comes in, really learns, works on the data, gets everything up and running, helps with that customization. That allows the legal department to still do their job.
Right.
And can focus on the implementation, then teach us in that 2-hour piece. So it can come down to, do you have time? Do you have people?
Right.
And do you have budget for additional resources?
Right. It's one of the reasons why it's one of our fastest growing practice areas. It's because exactly that. Every legal department is resource constrained. They want the output and the metrics and all of the good things that come with a nice new CLM system, but they don't have the resources to actually be like, okay, this is your job for 8 hours a day. They have to do their actual
And
steps.
to be frank, we're not that great at it. Like I deprogram my iPhone and rock myself out of my computer about once a week. Like the IT department sometimes just does drive-by checks to make sure I haven't broken something.
Right.
So I think that you have to realize you hired your lawyers to be lawyers. You didn't hire them to be software developers. And so sometimes you need a resource and you have to look to someone. But it may not be a resource that you need to hire on full time. You don't need a software developer or a CLM implementation on your staff. But that's when you can look to places who can provide you some temporary resources and really rely on them.
So one of the things, because obviously the focus of this discussion is really where we see the market going in 2025, but I do want to do just a small retrospective of where do you think the biggest successes or challenges were in 2024? What prevented people from getting kind of optimal tech adoption? Where did we see the most success and growth? So what's kind of your opinion on where you've seen that, not just CLM, but just legal tech in general?
I think legal tech in general, where the landscape was in 2024 was people were primed and they were ready for change,
Sure.
but also they're budget constrained.
Sure.
The economy made a lot of huge changes in 2024. We're going to continue to see that in 2025. It's something that takes a lot of investment because legal tech is something that doesn't make money.
Right.
It spends money. It has an ROI, but it's not an ROI that can be tangibly seen in that bank account.
Right.
And so it's very hard to explain sometimes to a board of, I need $100,000 for legal tech.
Right.
Or do I need $100,000 for business development that's going to turn into $1 million?
Right.
So I think that you have to really balance what the needs of the companies are at the time. In a changing economy with prices going up, coming out of post-pandemic era, which we think we're past that, but are there people still really operating like that?
Sure.
And they're a little scarred from the tech that they had to spend in 2020, 2021 to be able to have people working remote. On the other hand, I think the force into remote working has been great for legal tech because people are realizing this worked really well, but now we need centralized systems for our technology so that we can have people working anywhere. Yeah, it's a double-edged sword.
So it's very interesting what you were saying about legal tech in terms of kind of what, people testing it out or kind of the COVID era stuff. And as we talk about, kind of those challenges, now that budgets have reset in 2025, and as you said, the economy is kind of recovering or it's changing in certain areas. Crypto is a good example of that. Where do you think the most focused investment will be? Because as you mentioned, legal has been viewed as kind of the support center, right? So it's hard to report on to a certain degree, but you want additional data. But aside from just data, you want insights, right? And I'll give a very rudimentary example. So if you implement a metrics-based system, let's say it's a CLM, and you can see, okay, implementing the CLM accelerated the closing time of my sales contracts by an average of 3 days, right? There's a way to quantify the associated revenue if you're tracking it correctly, and you can report to your CFO or the board on that revenue acceleration, what that did from the bottom and top line of your business. So how do you see that kind of playing in terms of presenting that, and how do you see that evolving over 2025?
So I see that as huge, but the problem is you have to have a system implemented to get that data.
Yeah, 100%.
So it's in catch-22 if we implement this system to be able to show the improvements to have marked. I think where we're going to start seeing some, and I've been in oil and gas and energy and construction for a long time, so I tend to equate everything to my own industry.
Sure.
I think because some of the SEC reporting requirements are changing and they're under review right now, that might be something that really works towards legal tech because they're really looking to have some of that reporting, specifically in the ESG area, much more quantified. Companies haven't been doing that. There are ways that they can do that. And I think that that's a really good sales pitch, not only for legal to sell to their board, but also for some of those companies to sell to legal, to be able to say, hey, let's talk about what you have to report for ESG. How can we work and how can we assist you in tracking this on that type of software? Because I think as we continue to go, things are going to need to be more quantifiable. No questions asked. It is going to be a situation where you have to report on time, you have to report on turnaround, you have to report on revenue realized.
And as you've mentioned, this is classic in every industry, but the industry only changes when they're forced to, right?
Absolutely.
So because the SEC is making, more stringent compliance requirements, then they're actually reacting to, whatever's demanded of them, right? So it's not necessarily proactive, it's reactive, but it's definitely trending in the right direction.
And I think there's a bit of peer pressure too. Every time I hear one of my other, in-house counsel talking about the school system they got, and then they ask you, you have a little bit of, I want to be cool too. And so when you're talking to them, but a lot of times they're talking about how much easier it makes their life and how much easier it makes their department. So I think that the BES is going to continue in the networking, and that's going to be something. It may not continue in as many of the smaller privately held companies because they don't need it as much. But the big boys out there, they're all going to be looking at legal tech and what can make, but they're going to be looking at how they can maximize the dollars they spend for the functionality that they buy.
Right. So we've spoken about legal tech kind of holistically, but let's talk about what everyone is excited about and the term you hear all the time, which is generative AI and legal tech. So I want to talk a little bit about your experience with it, but also kind of the stories you've heard in your industry where, how are people leveraging generative AI? What are their experiences with it? What did 2024 look like? What does the industry need to improve on? And providers like us, where do we really need to focus our practice areas to deliver the maximum value for law firms and corporate legal departments?
So generative AI is great. It is new, it's fancy, it's shiny, it's something that everyone wants to have. It's also something everyone thinks is going to save them all this time, money, and their jobs. I think we have to view generative AI as a resource, not a solution. And that is going to be a really big piece of, if you see generative AI as something that can help bolster your legal department versus the solution to your problems, that's where you're going to start looking. So specifically, we've talked a lot about CLMs. Generative AI in there is great. It can start to learn your contracts. It can start to learn what the companies accept, where your baselines are, where your comfort zone is. It can start to pre-screen and push things out.
Right.
What I think that generative AI is doing for contract management is really giving the opportunity for legals to focus on what is legal versus a lot of that clerical stuff.
Right.
So while it's not going to eliminate a lawyer job, there might be some of that busy work that is eliminated by generative AI.
Right.
The thing is, though, everyone has heard the big cases where generative AI was used to draft a brief and it made up a case.
Right.
That's a danger that you have to have. So generative AI is not, it's still not a person. It is artificial intelligence.
It's really interesting because, as Morae, we want to be known as a solutions provider, essentially. And what you just said is really interesting because in no circumstance do we ever want to be like, here's a cool piece of technology. All right, here it is. Go figure it out and use it. We want to be the solution for you, right? So we want to have people implementing it to your actual environment. We want to have folks, your outsourced engagement team actually leveraging this tool. We want to pair it with the outsourced engagement team and your internal team to make sure that there's synergy. So you don't have to open an IT support ticket because you have no idea how the tool works. You can Teams your fellow attorney and they can walk you through it. It's much better than, a ServiceNow ticket, for example, right? So I think having that integration allows it to be a solution. But to your point, it's just a tool by itself, right? So we should treat it as such. And, at all these conferences over the past year, it was a common question. Am I going to lose my job because of this? And I really don't believe so. I think it's going to upskill certain people, and lawyers who know how to use legal technology and generative AI are going to be very successful and dominate market share. But it's not by itself in isolation. It's not doing anything. It is a tool for those attorneys.
And I do think that there are areas of the workforce that it might threaten. It might threaten some of the general clerical work where we're going through generative AI. We're doing some light drafting. But where I think is that generative AI, I love that it has the word generative in there,
right?
Because it's not called thinking AI,
right.
And that's what it doesn't eliminate. It generates a lot. It will learn your habits. It will learn your proclivities, it will learn your normal standards, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't think and get creative.
Right.
And it can't do that for you. And that's why I believe it's never going to replace the lawyers who are truly great, because you have to be able, as a lawyer, to think about creative solutions that are legal, but also work for your business. Because there's just a whole lot of being an in-house counsel that isn't yes or no, this is legal, yes or no.
Right.
98% of the things that come across my desk, yes, they are legal.
Right.
No one will go to jail for this. We will not get in trouble.
Right.
That's not the question. The question is, where's the risk tolerance of my company that we are willing to accept for this exact piece?
Right.
And that's different because the contract that we signed today, the risk tolerance might be different than the contract we signed tomorrow.
Right.
It may have to do with state. It may have to do with city. It may have to do with client. It may have to do with time. It may have to do with money. And that's not something that AI knows. AI knows your boilerplates and AI knows how to work around what you give it, but it doesn't know how to think and get creative on those pieces that have to do specifically with your business.
And that's where we want we want our attorneys doing high level. So we want the GCs, the AGCs, the DGCs, even senior counsel. We want them doing the high level strategic work, right? What we want is to use the tool for, as you said, kind of those boilerplate tasks.
This is strategic. AI isn't strategic. AI is generative. And that is something where that's going to differentiate what attorneys do versus what they can use AI for. AI is going to be used for a lot of that generative drafting, for a lot of pulling knowledge, but it's not strategic.
It's so interesting because it's almost like a nomenclature misnomer. So we call it artificial intelligence. And this goes beyond kind of the legal industry. But so we think of it as, oh, it's smart, it's intelligent. What it is an unbelievable data aggregator that spits out information in natural language or whatever format you want, which makes it seem like it's thinking. But what it's doing is it's giving you insights and it's giving you large-scale data aggregation very quickly, but it's giving you in exactly the format. And if you are not prompt engineering it correctly, you are the puppet master. It is spitting out what you needed to spit out in the correct format.
And it synthesizes data that it learned it from somewhere. AI didn't just pop up one day and say, I know all of this. It's learned it from a lot. So when you're working on your contracts or you're working on whatever you're using generative AI, it's because you've fed it this data for it to learn from. When you try to deviate from that data, that's when AI is going to struggle. And the one thing if you learn about in corporate legal is nobody is the same, no data is the same, and no contract is the same. So you have to really make sure that you're inputting there. I do think we're going to see a lot more of it, and I encourage it. But I encourage lawyers to stay very much on top of it because some things that it learns, I always say in the old joke of you can't teach an old dog new tricks, that can apply to AI because when AI learns something, it tends to learn something for life.
Right.
And so changing that can be very tough. And as a lawyer, you have to make sure that it didn't necessarily, knock you back into something that you don't do anymore.
Right.
This is a large example that probably wouldn't apply, but if you had AI drafting your force majeure clauses in 2018, 2019, and then you go through 2020 and you use it in 2021 to kick you out of force majeure, it probably hasn't learned that we've now added epidemic and pandemic into our force majeure.
Right.
Because it's something that was new. It's just spitting out what you did 10 years of force majeure clauses before, going, this always works.
Right.
But now the world has changed. Someone has to teach AI how the world changed.
And that, I think what you just called out is basically the difference between crappy AI tools and best-in-class AI tools, where crappy AI tools, you develop something and you're trying to retrofit it to every single use case under the sun, right? And I mean, I'm very proud of the tool we developed. We call it Morae Legal Companion.
And your tool is great, I will say.
It's constant improvement, right? Because to your point, something that applied a year ago, it may not apply this year, or it may not apply next year. It has to be constantly retrofitted, constantly tinkered with in order to fit your business, right? Because your business is not going to have the same fiscal plan, it's not going to have the same contract repository. So it has to evolve with your business, right? So the AI tools that were created, a year ago that fit this one use case, but we're trying to plug in this IP specific generative AI patent drafting tool to a compliance use case, that's not necessarily going to work. But if you're tinkering with the underlying, engineering of the tool, and then it's learning how to interact with new subject areas, that's where kind of best-in-class technology lies.
I think you're gonna see a lot of AI having to relearn stuff this year specifically. There's been a lot of change just in the new changeover administration already.
100%.
If you use AI to draft a document on something like, we'll keep it non-political, but on immigration law, and you used to draft it last week versus this week, your answer is going to be probably the same on generative AI,
right,
but not going to be the same in the world anymore. Right. So that's something where you have to continually stay on top of it.
And before we pivot to another interesting topic in legal operations, I want to mention there's legal engineer, for example, right? That is not a job that necessarily existed 5 years ago, and now we need it because we need legal engineers to fix the AI tools, to constantly improve them, to make sure that, to your point, something in immigration existed in this state, 5 weeks ago, and now it exists in this state. The legal engineer needs to program the system to work correctly for the legal department.
Absolutely.
So the topic I want to pivot to is legal operations. I really want your opinion on this, because what I've seen is an odd polarization in legal operations. I'm obviously a big fan of legal operations, process, technology, people. However, I've seen two things happen. What legal operations kind of sat in the middle and they were partially decision makers. Now they've either been ultra empowered and have, budget authority, or they've kind of gone the opposite direction and positions have gotten eliminated, or they've got reduction in responsibility. It's a weird polarization. I'm curious on your opinion on whether you agree with that and why.
So I agree with the fact that it's become very polarized, and I think I know why. Because when you separate so much in legal operations, I'm a huge fan. I think legal operations is something that we have needed for a long time. But I'm a fan of keeping it very integrated in the legal department and being a part of that.
Me too.
Because I think if you separate legal operations, it's just like legal is separated from the business operations.
Sure.
Of most of the time, your legal operations folks are not going to be someone who comes from a law background, and they are not necessarily doing the legal work. They are focused on other things.
Sure.
As part of that, they may not understand the ramifications of some of their decisions of how it affects the lawyers and attorneys. So I think that they have to work hand in hand. The problem is when you say you're a completely separate department, you have a totally different budget, and you have full decision power over something, you may not have the people who actually have to use it being able to weigh in. And that's the issue. Legal operations tends to implement it and tends to do it, but they may not be that end user.
Right.
And that's where the divide can come of you have to have the people who are using it being able to understand and weigh in, because there are times where I or my legal operations manager would think that this system or this piece of tech was so good, we'd go to someone in the department and they go, well, that doesn't work for X, something that we never thought of. But if we gone ahead and just done it because we're legal operations, this is what we do, we would have missed that feedback.
Right.
So I think that integrating them, but I also think that empowering them on that first part is great. They need to be the ones who are evaluating, who are looking up, who are suggesting, who are testing and demoing. I think that you need to have those meetings before with your legal department to say, what are we looking for right now? What are our top 5 priorities? But also, what are our top or our low 5 priorities? What are the things that we're okay with staying status quo?
Right.
We don't need to fix this. This isn't a huge thing. We deal with this once a month. Where do we have those pieces? Because then your legal ops department really has a guide where they can go, they can learn, they can test, they can adapt, they can bring back to you very, very educated opinions on what they think would help you for you to then collaborate.
It's the holistic philosophy of do nothing in isolation,
Mhm.
right? So just like I'm not a fan of legal departments being viewed as purely support centers, but actual business partners to the executive team, I view legal operations the same way, right? These are value added folks who can give you all of the insights that you might need to make a decision, and you work collaboratively to make that decision, right? So to your point, legal operations may have a recommendation because it's best in class technology, but it's not going to fit 55% of your use cases. So why pay millions of dollars to implement them? Why waste people's time if it's not going to hit over half of your requirements, right? So it's those kind of considerations where I'm worried about the polarization in terms of the negative direction it's going, but I'm happy that I see more legal operations department being viewed as partners to the legal department.
Absolutely. And I think one good example that I've seen in the past year of how, if you have a huge divide where they don't work together, can be an issue of a big thing legal operations loves to implement right now are the AI recording assistants.
Yeah.
And so they love to have the meeting assistant, you log on to Zoom and you're like, who's down there? My meeting note taker.
Hey, Jen, before
note taker in the corner, and you don't know whose it is, it's a crappy name.
Right.
And so some of the issues with that, Legal Tech loves it because Legal Tech goes, great. We are using AI, we have a new technology, and we have transcripts of everything we're doing. The lawyers, on the other hand, are going, I am not saying a single word on this conversation because this is recordable.
Right.
And recordable and written down to lawyers means discoverable.
Right.
And so now that it's testimony, that is something that's written down, and it can be depending on the circumstance.
Right.
So I think that understanding and having that legal input of being able to say, there's times that I've said, hey guys, this is a conversation we don't want the legal AI note taker to have.
Right.
This is something we are on the phone for a reason. If your lawyer ever texts you and says, hey, just give me a call. Hey, you have a few minutes to just you're in a shop, and they say, well, can you just text? No, just give me a call and you get a free time. It's probably because they don't want something to be in writing.
Right.
And that is able to happen. And it's because it can be discoverable, your text messages, your emails, but also those written recordings and those verbal recordings, because they are a true and accurate representation.
Right.
And so that's something that we have to look for. Legal ops may not see that, having not come from the true legal side, but I think that it's really important to, as lawyers, explain why there are risks and dangers to some of the technologies.
And it's a very interesting point because you can almost see it perpetuating itself, right? So you're using generative AI technology or meeting recording technology to get all of this data about what people are speaking about, or literally to transcribe and basically synthesize off of that. And then you see all of these discoverable things coming out of it, which feeds the generative AI practice for e-discovery, for example, right? Because again, this is large amounts of recording data that you need to feed into something to give you quick insight. So you're almost using a generative AI mechanism to power another generative AI offering.
Scheduling has a benefit and a drawback.
Right.
The benefit is that can help other generative AI. The drawback is that you might talk about something that you really don't want replayed in court. I always say you don't put anything in email that you probably wouldn't send to your grandmother.
Right.
And that's the same thing with generative AI of if you're going to have an AI note taker, you don't want to put anything on there that you wouldn't want a judge reading to you out loud in front of a courtroom of your peers.
Right.
And so it's something that we have to be very cognizant and knowledgeable of. There are also some other softwares that are, I think they have huge benefits. They are email scanners. And so there are certain things where before you send an email, it will flag and it will say, hey, you've got a dirty word in here or something that we don't like to put in an email that goes externally. Part of that is great. It prevents you from sending an external email. What it does is it cannot necessarily always apply internally, or it saves a copy of that email. So sometimes you have to look into, hey, is this a third party, something that's scanning my email that's now making a copy of it?
Right.
Because if you have that and you now have a record of every email you tried to send with something that had a no-no word on it, then you've created a record of that as well.
Sure.
So it's just being very careful. The more technology we get, the more we record and document our lives.
Right.
And lawyers love and hate documenting at the same time. We want your good documentation, but we really hope you didn't record the bad conversation. So we're register. Exactly. You want it both ways.
Right.
But that's part of it. The more that we're documenting and the more that we are creating, the more risk we are creating.
Right. So speaking, and this is for me a logical segue, but speaking of many different kind of technology synergizing with each other, as a GC, if you have, for example, if your budget constrained and you have $500,000 to spend on some legal technology, right now, where would you put it? If you're in a mid to large company or even a small company, and you are working in a very rudimentary way, so you're working on spreadsheets or email, and you could pick one, you could pick a matter management system, you could pick an ELM, you could pick a drafting assistant powered by generative AI. Where do you focus your attention and funds to drive maximum value?
So I think you have to establish what your needs are. For me, what I would say any legal department needs, and that's regardless of where, and I'm not talking anyone specific, but I think where you really need to go is something that fits all of those needs. If you have $500,000, that is actually not a lot of budget for legal tech.
Right.
You're getting something. You may not get the right. Two of my last legal tech that I implemented, the budget was a lot lower than that. Sure. So, but I think you need to look for what you can do where a legal tech that has options and optionality. And so they have things that are out of the box and they have things that are customizable.
Right.
But you need to look for something that has both. So out of the box technology is great where you can say, this is ready to implement and we're ready to do this. What can we quickly solve our problems? But what can we add on to this to solve other issues and organize? How can we maximize that money that we're spending?
Right.
So if we've got a contract management system in there that has a repository, which I think is key for all companies because everyone has, the C drive, the S drive, the Z drive, whatever your company calls it, where you have, you've scrolled into legal, you've gone into matter management, you've gone to contracts, you've gone an MSA, and you're 9 folders deep and you're looking at, 400 PDFs. Every company has that. So if you have something that can organize that for you and synthesize your data, but it also has a drafting module.
Right.
Because what it does is if you have something that does both, they can take your old contracts, they can learn from your language habits. So they can generate new ones that are easier. So what it does is it makes your life easier on having your data, but it also uses your data to help you with new agreements.
Right.
So I think that you have to look for something that solves more than one problem at a time.
Right.
Legal tech that only solves one issue or only sells one thing is a thing of the past. And you're seeing it right now. If you follow anyone on LinkedIn that's in legal tech, and I follow, to be very frank with you, probably too many.
Okay.
I have a lot of legal tech koozies in my office.
That's not so bad.
But you're seeing they're now offering it's, this is your add-on, this is your value add, just your additional piece. Let's talk about this module. They're all doing it because they know you're not selling a one-trick pony anymore. No one is spending $250,000 on just a contract drafting software.
Right.
You have contract drafting people.
Right.
You spend $250,000 on some of them sometimes,
right.
But you have to have more than that. It has to do more.
Right.
That's to store. It has to synthesize. It has to draft.
Right.
It has to have tracking. It has to send externally. It has to have stakeholders.
Right.
You have to have what does more. So I would pick my top 3 problems and I would say, this is what I want to do. And this is what I want to contain in my legal tech. And I would pick something that does it all. It doesn't have to be the flashiest one, but I would pick something that basically addresses all of those.
And it was a bit of a loaded question. Obviously, you are ultra sophisticated, so you answered it in such a comprehensive, amazing way. I will tell you that when I've asked a similar question, I've posted to a group, the answer is often, I don't know. And it's one of the reasons why a legal tech consulting business has just been in rapid growth is because it's hard to know. It's hard to know where to spend your money. You have FOMO. We talked about FOMO. It's like, oh, my competitor is doing this, so I have to jump in there. I have to make a big financial decision because, my competing law firm is doing the exact same thing, right? But other than just FOMO, you need a sophisticated methodology on how to spend good amounts of budget. I said $500,000.
First, you need a sophisticated methodology on understanding where your bottlenecks are. And I think that's actually the issue that causes the I don't know. Legal departments are busy. It is a new thing to say we're having a lean legal department.
Right.
We are, we're working, we have the least people we can to do the maximum work. What that doesn't allow is anyone to really step back and postmortem a situation and go, wow, this didn't work, or this is my day-to-day problem. They're in their comfort zone. They stay in their lane. This is just, my favorite phrase is, well, this is just how we do it here.
Right.
Well, just how you do it here, it might be the problem. Right. We're too close to it to be able to step back and realize that that's actually your issue.
Right.
If you do have the ability to step back, but mostly the departments are not challenged and they're not sitting there, legal departments don't have the same strategic retreat that the executive team, operations do. They don't, go to Vail or wherever we're going on retreats now.
Right.
I don't go on them, so I don't even know where they are. But they don't have those strategy sessions where they sit back and go, let's diagnose our problems.
Right.
Let's look at our bottlenecks. How can we be better?
Right.
They're hanging on for mother loving dear life, trying to get those contracts out for the operations folks before the next one comes in.
Right.
So I think the reason that they don't know where they're going to spend their money is because they don't know what their problems are.
100%. And that's why we call the practice area at Morae, we call it more AI assessments, but it's essentially because no legal department has the bandwidth or the expertise to be like, oh, this is where we need to focus. That's where we need to focus. This is where the bottleneck is, to your point.
And that was I do an assessment because you have to look 100%. Overall.
Right. It's a holistic exercise. It's not, IP is missing their SLAs by 3 days. It's okay, but why is that happening? Is this a departmental function? It's because they're not getting response.
Do we not have the filing system?
Right.
Is it not with Dr. Is nobody getting the notice? You have to diagnose and assess where the issues are.
Right.
But legal departments aren't designed to do that. Legal departments don't have a QA person that's in there. They're not looking back to see what the problem is. They're fixing the error and they're moving on because something else has hit their desk in that time.
Right. So one thing I wanted to ask you about is where you see in 2025 predictive analytics and actually giving, because you mentioned kind of non-strategic AI, and I mentioned, really data aggregation is what specializes in. However, it does give us the analytics to make predictions. So how do you see the market leveraging those predictions most effectively in 2025? Or do you think it won't be that effective and we're going to have a lot of data, but not necessarily the synthesis of what that data can do for a legal department?
So I will say I think we're going to get a lot of data.
Yes.
That's the first thing. I think companies have started implementing legal tech and they're getting their data.
Sure.
I think that we will have aggregated data. I
Sure.
don't think we will all know what it means and what we should do with it yet.
Sure.
And that's where the divide is. And we're going to have it, but because it's data that we've never had before, we don't always know where to go.
Right.
And so I think that 2025 is going to be key of how do we use some of these dashboards?
Right.
How do we implement some of this data?
Right.
And how do we educate the people in the business around us to know what this means? Because if we're going, well, this is 3.5 days faster and we have X amount of time, it may not have in there, and you may realize that going through, so I'm going, okay, well, I get my contracts done 3 days faster. And they're going, well, what does that mean?
And part of the problem too, what does that mean, is because if you never had a legal technology solution previously, how are you baselining it?
Yes.
Is it anecdotal? So, I think this department responds.
Remember, 3 days faster. 3 days faster than what?
Right. There's no way to track it.
And then also they're not seeing where the bottlenecks are. And so it might be that we're 3 days faster in getting it done, but it might be that it sat on, the executive's desk or the board desk for 3 days.
Right.
And now it just sends them a pulse email. And so it's something that I don't know if we're able to analyze and to be able to use that data more. I also think it's going to teach us how to continue to develop our systems.
Right.
So one thing, if you're looking at contracts and you're looking at how's our speed, what is our return on investment, something that we may not be putting in there is the value of some of those change orders. So let's use the master service example, master service agreement. Most companies operate on them. Master service agreements are a large operating contract.
Sure.
You don't tend to have a dollar amount attached to it. They're what you do everything under it. You don't worry, you attach your work order, but on your, you pull up your dashboard, it's got all your little things. You may not be attaching what the dollar values of all those are.
Right.
So putting in there, so learning how to be able to contribute and how to aggregate that data in a way that matters to other stakeholders. And other stakeholders may not care about 3 days, but other stakeholders care about $3 million.
Right.
And so I think that you need to learn as part of the data of when presenting this, what is the language and what appeals? What are the money movers, or what are the pieces that matter to others?
It's a really good point, and this is where I think generative AI has one of its key values. So, 4 or 5 years ago, large-scale CLMs, they tried to aggregate this data, but for example, contract value, it was a manually inputted field post-execution.
Mm-hmm.
So you had to rely on the attorneys to actually put in, okay, this is a $3 million contract or whatever. Now you have kind of the automation of the extraction of value. So you have that financial data and you know what to do with it. You know what contracts are important. You know when the renewal date is. You know what to get ahead of it 6 months. If you're negotiating with a large CRM provider, you're going to get the best quarter end discounts or whatever it is. And that's actual tangible financial value. But extracting that value is no longer optional, or it's no longer relying on attorneys to manually input it. It's actually generatively, extracting that information.
And I think we can use AI and the predictive AI to help us.
Yeah.
Because they're seeing, and you should use other companies. You should use companies like Morae to say, we have this data.
Right.
We have this synthesized. What does this mean? What should we be looking at now? Is there functionality in the tech that we have that we should use to help us with this data? Or you can even ask AI, Google into AI, what does my board care about?
Right.
What does the executive team in a construction company want to see contract-wise? And it's going to give you some options. You might look at that and go, wow, we don't track that in our system.
Right.
That's something you go back to your contract provider, your tech provider, and say, hey, we need to add and we need to implement. The one thing I think we're going to see in 2025 is that a lot of the legal tech that we already have and we've already purchased, we're going to evolve and we're going to push.
Right.
And I think that that's something you have to do. If you bought legal tech in 22, 23, even early 24, and you're not updating it in 25, you're missing the boat.
Right. I want to ask you about a market education problem. So every single GC I've ever spoken to or spoken about, our Morae AI solution, specifically Companion, is, hey, do you share my client data? Do you use it to train your models? And the answer is universally no. However, they're convinced, the market is convinced that basically all this client data is commingled and it's shared, and this client is used to train this client's instance. So how can we do a better job educating the market that this is safe and we're not using your data to populate other client instances?
I think that's a battle you're going to have to fight forever. GCs and attorneys are inherently suspicious of privacy.
Yes, they should.
Especially because if you had to ask what one of the number one kind of legal issues overall this year, it's going to be privacy and cybersecurity.
Sure.
That's just something that is on the run and rising as a fear and a concern. And we're the fear mongers. It's our job to be the ones that are a little paranoid about it. So what I think you have to do is find a way to show how AI is trained. And so you come to us and you say, we have this AI tool.
Right.
Great. And you're like, and it's trained, it knows, it speaks, it drafts, it does all these things.
Best friends.
Yeah, it's your best friend. It's going to make your life so much easier. How? You need to have something in there that shows, like, so what did you get it to this baseline training? Or how did you get it there?
Right.
Because I understand once I give you my data that you've done something and you've put it together and you've trained it for me.
Right.
But it can kind of train. It was a puppy that wasn't 8 weeks, but this puppy was like 6 to 9 months and could already, sit, squat, and roll over.
Right.
I want to know how it got there.
Right.
And so I think you need to talk about how you train your baseline AI and what you put into that, because then they will understand that this comes with a baseline. This is Microsoft Office Suite. It's got Word.
Right.
You haven't downloaded your cool fonts yet. Put it in there.
Right.
But I think people need to see what that base is, and nobody understands. And I'll tell you, it's like the cloud. Nobody understands the cloud. I don't understand the cloud. But it's amorphous. It's a thing. Everybody knows how it works. How it works until it doesn't. You said it doesn't back it up.
Right.
So you dropped it out of your car one day in the snow.
Right.
Certainly not me yesterday. But you have to have a way to be able to show them of what the base is so that they can have a basic understanding. And your lawyers are going to be the hard ones, because we went to law school because we couldn't get into engineering school and we weren't good at math. Maybe it's just me, but a lot of us have, history, English, political science lawyers behind us. We were not STEM people.
Right.
So I don't understand how AI all the time got to where it is, to where you bring it to me to show me.
Right. And I mentioned demos. It's such a good point, because I mentioned demos earlier. Everything looks good in a demo environment, right? One of the things I dislike about most demos nowadays with legal technology is that, yes, it works perfect. And yes, you're showing the one use case for an NDA that you've done, and sure, it works. But you're not showing any of the back end. You're not showing the prompt engineering. You're not showing how you actually uploaded the playbook rules and how it's surgically. So, this is a must for all of our demos, and our whole team is instructed to do this. You have to show the backend settings. You have to show how you prompt engineering this. You have to show how you're actually getting to the results, because we're dealing with the community of skeptics. So, this works because I'm showing you a demo environment and I'm telling you it works. That's not going to play. Either folks have to play with it themselves, or you have to show them exactly how that sauce is made so that they can see, oh, I believe it. This isn't the cloud. This isn't an ethereal thing. This is a real thing. This is how it learned. This is how it got here. And this is the result.
And this isn't something that you just pulled from your other clients and said, go building on it. They need to understand that AI is something that lives at a baseline and learns for you.
Right.
So I think that that's going to be really key. We're always going to be skeptical. It's our job, but you can convert us.
Right. And so I guess I'll wrap with this, because, in 2025, if we want to move towards optimal, if us as a legal tech provider and corporate legal departments want to move towards optimal and very harmonize with each other, what is the best way to maximize value from a legal operations or corporate legal department with the integration of legal tech? So how can you go to your CFO or your executive leadership or your CEO and say, this is how I used legal tech to create maximum value, and here is the impact of it? What do those tangible steps look like?
So the tangible steps first are determining what matters to the people you are presenting.
Sure.
Your stakeholders, you need to know what matters to them. Because if time and turnaround doesn't matter to them, why are you presenting it?
Right.
If it's just DIRES and if it's just budget, that's what you have to. So learning and isolating what's very important for your company is going to be what's key. On the other hand, you have to then understand how that impacts and how that can pull from the data that you have. So it may not be something that the minute you get legal tech, 3 months in, you're able to go like, wow, look, oh my gosh, all this is so great.
Right.
You're probably going like, I have no idea how to use this dashboard. I'm so not sure. And part of that is going to be explaining the learning process to your operations people. I think part of that you can depend on some of your external resources to be able to show that it hasn't interrupted business.
Right.
That is a huge piece for your operations and your executive suite, is they want to know you implemented legal tech, but how did we operate through it?
Right.
Because the number one way that people who aren't in legal argue against legal tech is to go, well, it shut down my legal department.
Right.
It stopped our workflow. I didn't get my contracts because they were too busy implementing this legal tech, and all legal tech done has slowed me down.
Right.
So you have to be able to show a reason of why it hasn't interrupted your legal piece yet, but also how it's going to help going forward.
And this is one of the reasons why Agile has just taken over from kind of waterfall methodology, but you have to start small. So if you have kind of a couple of tech forward attorneys in your department, have them test this out 1 hour per day and start with that. Don't say, stop all your work, use this generative AI technology, and that's all you can use. And then they can't deliver because they don't know how to use it and they have to get trained. You have them test it for an hour, a baseline test, see if it really does save them 3 hours. And then, okay, now it's 2 hours. Now I'm saving this much time. But you do it very incrementally. So we're not disrupting.
We're doing it type by type.
Right.
So when I've implemented it before, I've done it of types of contracts first. We're switching this over first.
Right.
Let's talk about getting our NDAs in here. Let's make this an easier process. Okay. We've all learned we're good. Now let's move on to something else. Let's move on to a master service agreement.
Right.
You have to be able to make sure that you put it in, it works, and that people get it. And you have to figure out what segue of that works.
Right.
If it is, hey, we have one attorney that we're going to have be full-time, they're going to learn, they're going to be up and running, they're going to be fully devoted to this project. If you have the resource for that, great. But if you don't, you have to determine how you can spread your resources elsewhere.
Start with 2 through workflows. Don't start with 40 and then you go figure it out.
It's figure it out, because also once you learn one workflow, it's going to be easier to do another, and you're going to learn from it. And so I think that part of it is understanding that legal tech is something everyone goes like, I bought a software. Well, it's not like buying shoes. I can't go to the mall today and I'm wearing my shoes tomorrow. You don't buy legal tech today and it's up and running tomorrow.
Right.
People don't understand. It's not a 3 to 4 month period too. It's probably a 12 to 14 month period. And I'm myself a fallen victim of that. And I've sold it as a 6 month implementation because that's what you think.
Right.
And you are super confident in yourself that I've got this. And I do not got this all the time. But you have to understand that it is a process, but it's a process that has to be balanced with what you're doing. Because legal still at the end of the day, while we can be revenue generating, supports our overall business.
Right. So we started the conversation kind of going a retrospective of what happened in 2024. So fast forward 12 months, let's say we're sitting in these exact chairs in January 2026. Okay. What are we going to be talking about? Let's say 3 things. What are the 3 things we are going to be talking about that happened in the legal tech landscape in 2025?
So I think we're going to be talking about the major changes in some of the legal tech. I think there are going to be the big pieces. And I also would forecast, I think there's probably going to be someone that comes out as a new big player.
Agreed.
Something that we don't
Hopefully
know.
It's us.
Hopefully it's you. Yeah, we're already a player, but I anticipate that someone's going to come out with something very, very new, and it's going to combine a lot of what we're doing.
Right.
Obviously, people will then follow suit.
Right.
I think we're probably going to talk about a very large public failure on it, where it happened, we've talked about it all year, about that big case where the case was cited wrong and nobody checked it. I think we're going to have a failure, and I think that that's going to be a lesson that we can continue to learn from.
One provider is going to make, or one court is supposed to make the mistake, and everyone else
is going to have a mistake that is going to be absolutely massive. And I think we're going to talk about it because we're gonna dateline that for sure and probably shred them. And but we're going to learn from it then, and we're all going to take note. So I think we're going to have a new player. I think we're going to have a very large mistake, but I also think we're going to have a lot of insight into how legal tech is being forced to adapt to the changing political climates.
Absolutely. And as part of our job as consultants and as a legal tech provider to help everyone, including yourself, navigate the environment, we're supposed to give you advice, but then we're supposed to give you a roadmap on how to optimize this, right? So that's our objective for 2025. Hopefully we succeed. We plan on it. Hopefully you succeed from the corporate side.
Absolutely.
And then we're, it's one big harmony and happy family. And then us, Generative AI, we're all best friends at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Well, Sam, it was an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. Thanks for coming out. And
thank you so much for having me.
And I look forward to this in exactly 12 months from today.
Wonderful. I'll see you there.
All right.